All right. Hello again, adventures, and welcome to another exciting in-depth review. Due to the fact that I'm just assuming the people over at Renegade just hate me, they have yet again released a PDF of a book early, significantly earlier than I was expecting. Luckily, I was able to shift around some purchases that I was intending to make this month to be able to get this. But the Field Guide to Action and Adventure PDF is available right now. If you pre-order the physical book, you get the PDF for free. And then obviously you can get the PDF on its own as well. So I figured it was a good time for me to do an in-depth review. Quick reminder, if you do enjoy this stuff, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to turn notifications on. All those things are super important. Let's talk about this nonsense. So, my in-depth reviews are exactly that. They are in-depth. And by in-depth, I mean I am going to talk about the things that I like, the things that I don't like, the things I think they did well, the things that I think they need to do better. I'm going to go chapter by chapter, sometimes page by page. It's a very long and involved process, and a lot of people really don't want to sit through an hour and a half or 2 hour long video just to figure out if they want to buy this or something. So I always start all my in-depth reviews with three basic sections, which are all should you buy this, and I separate potential buyers into three different groups. The first group is what I call players. Players are people that are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily going to be playing a single player character and enjoying the game that way. The second group is what I call GMs or DMs. And they are the people that are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily going to be sitting in the game master chair or the storyteller chair or whatever they want to call it in whatever system you're playing. They have a very different set of needs and wants than players are going to have. The final group that I separate potential buyers into is what I call Lorehounds. Lorehounds may never sit at an RPG table at all, but they're really interested in the setting itself, the lore that drives it, maybe some of the kind of in-game explanations of mechanics and things like that. And obviously they have very, very different needs than the rest of those groups. So, should you buy this? Well, let's answer that question. The first group, should players buy this? So, Wizards of the Coast differentiates their books into two different kind of categories. You have source books and you have adventures. And just about everyone else in the market does effectively the same thing. You have source books and you have adventures. Some adventures do come with character options, and some source books do come with adventure links or mini adventures in them. But in general, you can kind of separate those into two different things. And then one other differentiation that I tend to make is the difference between just a core book and what I call a campaign setting, where a core book explains or expands upon the core aspects of the game. It adds new classes or roles or something like that. And a campaign setting literally creates a new world to use all of those mechanics in. And a lot of times, campaign settings will also include new character options, but the focus of a campaign setting is not really to present new options. It's to present a new world, and part of presenting that world is including new options. So what kind of book is the Field Guide to Action and Adventure? And I guess I just realized I forgot to mention, we're doing the Field Guide to Action and Adventure. It's in the title of the book, or in the video, but in case you didn't know. So what exactly kind of book is the Field Guide to Action and Adventure? Closest I can say is it's kind of a source book. I wouldn't really call this a campaign setting because it's not really creating a new campaign setting. It's showing you how to mix different campaign settings. But for the most part, this is a mechanics book. Because of that, players can get a lot out of this. I'm going to be blunt with you. Chapters 2 and 3, 2 is crossover character creation, and 3 is new crossover options. Effectively, those 2 chapters are the ones that are going to be most interesting to players. Maybe a little bit of chapter 1, which basically just explains how the book works. It's called Introduction to Action and Adventure. But most is going to be chapter 2 and 3. And to just massively oversimplify what this is a multi-classing guide. That's literally what this is. Because it effectively allows you to take roles from other settings that don't technically work exactly the same, and take origins and influences and kind of mix them between settings. And the reason I say that is technically, yes, all of these systems are intercompatible. All the Essence20 systems you can play together. But if you create a Transformer and have them join a team of Power Rangers, they're going to play very, very differently. And based on just the core books, it doesn't really work to turn a Transformer into a Power Ranger. They don't have its morphing time perk that allows them to actually morph. They don't really fit into the setting. Like, you really have to create excuses and things like that. And mechanically, Transformers just operate differently than Power Rangers. Transformers have an alt mode. Transformers, you use Energon power, whereas Power Rangers use grid power. Power Rangers have Zords and grid powers and all this stuff, and their morphing massively changes how they work. So as of right now, you theoretically could run games with those different things together, but it was kind of hard. And you did have to take some narrative shortcuts to make it kind of make sense. This gives you some pretty robust rules, which I'll go into more specifics when we do the in-depth review, of how to take a Power Rangers role and turn it into a Transformers role, and vice versa. So if you wanted a Power Ranger, but you didn't like any of the Red Ranger or the Black Ranger roles, you could take I think it's Commander is one of the Transformer roles. You can take that, and by doing the things that they outline in this book, you can turn it into a Power Rangers role and have an extremely unique Power Ranger. And the same thing is true about influences and origins. Influences are significantly easier to kind of transfer because they're just, kind of background stuff, and you can make them. Origins are, for the most part, fairly easy to transfer, with the caveat of Transformers Origins give the character a bot mode and an alt mode, which massively changes how the things work. So there are rules for all of those things. And as far as players are concerned, as far as players are concerned, there's not a ton of new things in here. There is a new role that's introduced here. I think it's called the Envoy, which works in any setting. You can be an Envoy without having to change anything. It works in any setting. Your focus for the Envoy, which is something that doesn't exist in Power Rangers, but it does in G.I. Joe and Transformers. Your focus, effectively your subclass, will help you fit into whatever world you want to be in. But other than the Envoy role, there's not a ton of new content as far as just absolutely everything new. However, with all the rules about how to basically take stuff from other systems and make it work, take stuff from G.I. Joe and make it work in Power Rangers, or take stuff from Transformers and make it work in G.I. Joe, it effectively becomes almost exponential growth. So yes, there are some new influences. There are some new origins. There is one new role, but the big thing here is you can now mix and match roles and influences and origins from different systems and different books effectively. Like the new Across the Stars book that I did my in-depth review before, you can do that too. So these new rules are complicated enough that I cannot tell you how balanced they are. From running my own Power Rangers game and reading them over, they look solid to me. But they're complicated enough that I personally would want to playtest them before giving my 100% stamp of approval. However, I do trust the people over at Renegade. They have mentioned that they have been playing crossover Giga games for over a year. Like when I did my first in-depth review of Power Rangers, they mentioned, no, we do crossover games and stuff like that. Or it might have been G.I. Joe, whatever. So I'm fair. I personally think you can be fairly confident that these rules are going to work, but they're very, very different. And for players, especially if you are not a mechanically minded player where you tend to lean a little bit more into the kind of role play aspect and you kind of have someone else help you to get all the mechanics down, this is a very mechanic heavy book. As long as you're okay with having to read things 3 or 4 times, like I'm good with mechanics. I had to read a few of these sections 3 or 4 times just because there's a lot here to understand. As long as you're willing to do that, there is so much content here for players. As far as a recommendation, if you already have multiple books, multiple Essence20 books, this book pays for itself. It really, really does. However, the one limitation of this book is it requires you to have at least 2 other books to do any kind of crossover content, because they don't reprint anything in here and they make a lot of references to the other books. So this book, buying it on its own is not going to be useful really almost at all. You have to have the other 3 books. So that increases the cost of this by a significant amount. Buying 1 book is no longer enough. You basically have to buy at least 3 or all 4 of the books to get the most benefit out of it. Do I think this is worth that purchase? I do. For players specifically, as long as you already own at least 2 other books, you don't need to own 3, but as long as you own at least 2 other Essence20 books from different systems, so you have a Power Rangers and a Transformers, or a G.I. Joe and a Power Rangers, something like that, this book is 100% worth it. The $55 plus shipping and handling, which turns, I think shipping and handling for me was like another $13 or $14, is definitely worth it for players. If you don't own at least 2 books, this is going to have significantly less use for you. It still has some use if you have at least 1 other book, because the Envoy is new and there's new influences and origins and stuff like this, but you get the best benefit if you already own a few of the books. If you don't own any of the books yet, consider purchasing 1 or 2 of those books before you get this one, because this one really relies on you understanding the system better than just a beginner, and you have to have other books in order to get the most benefit out of this. So for players, hardcover, it is a recommendation of picking it up with the caveat of you need to have at least 2 other Essence20 books in different settings to get the most benefit out of this. And then the PDF, again, is kind of a no-brainer. I think the PDF is like 38 or 33, something like that. It's in the 30s somewhere. It's definitely worth the PDF price, just again with that caveat of you need to have other books for this book to be useful to you. So, moving on. The second group. Should game masters buy this? So, as I mentioned before, this is effectively a multi-classing book. Now, when I say multi-classing, I don't specifically mean multi-classing as in, well, I want to, change roles and stuff like that. It's not technically what I mean, because the Essence20 system is really not meant for you to change classes midway. I mean, they have in Across the Stars, the Power Rangers, the new Power Rangers as a supplement. They actually do have perks that allow you to effectively multi-class by taking role perks from other roles. Those exist. But this allows you to create these weird kind of hybrid classes. I guess that's the best way to kind of describe it is if you played 4th edition, introduced in, I think, Player's Handbook 3, they introduced what were called hybrid classes. And hybrid classes were basically you took 2 classes and you jammed them into one. And every time you leveled up, you would get to choose between, when you would get a new power, you would choose between, you would have the options of both classes, and you'd have to choose one every level. And because of that, the hybrid classes actually had different kind of starting abilities and stuff like that, because again, you were getting 2 things, so they had to kind of cut it in half, and you didn't get all the proficiencies when you made a hybrid class. As other things, you didn't get all of the class features with a hybrid class. So that's kind of how these new crossover characters work, is effectively this is creating hybrid classes, and it's really, really interesting how it does that. In addition to the new character options, which I think are very useful for GMs, especially if you do want to create some interesting stuff. Chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 are all geared towards GMs. Starting from page 75, going all the way to page 253 is just loads of GM stuff. Chapter 4 specifically talks about how to be a GM, talks about different GMing styles, different play styles that players have, how to deal with some examples of problem players. There's some other stuff in there that I think is really stupid advice, to be 100% honest, but I understand why they put it in there. They needed, I hate to say this because I have the utmost respect for the people at Renegade, but they needed their woke points, and there's one specific thing that I'm going to call out in my review as just being massively, stupidly bad advice, because they needed their woke points. I get it. I understand why you did it. It was a mistake, and it's going to come back to bite you in the ass. I will guarantee this. But Chapter 4 is a really, really great book for just understanding how to be a GM. Chapter 5 goes over, it's creating threats, talks about the entirety of how threat design works. It was something that I really wanted in the Power Rangers book, and they released a supplement that explained a little bit more about how threats work, because in the Power Rangers core book, they don't even explain how to read a threat stat block. So they had to release that as a separate free download. Just so you could understand how to do it. In both G.I. Joe and Transformers, they explain how threats work and how to read the stat block. They really don't teach you how to build your own. And so you have to kind of backwards engineer and reverse engineer how to create it. Chapter 5 actually teaches you how to create threats for all 3 systems, and it actually gives you tips on each different system. And that's something that you see constantly through this entire thing, is every time they do something, how to game master Power Rangers, how to game master G.I. Joe, how to game master Transformers, and how to kind of generally game master Essence20. Same thing, creating threats, how to create Power Rangers threats, G.I. Joe threats, Transformers threats, crossover threats. Creating scenes, how to create Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, Transformers, crossover. Creating adventures, they go with the generic and then Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, Transformers, crossover. This is really, really good stuff. Even if, again, you're not really interested in the worlds of Power Rangers or G.I. Joe or Transformers, but you like the system in and of itself. The Essence20 system is a super solid system. It really, really is. And even if you're not a Power Rangers fan or a G.I. Joe fan or a Transformers fan, and you just want a different kind of system that plays differently than really anything else on the market I'm aware of, there's so much here to learn from. Like, it's really, 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 really good information. Again, aside from one real stupid thing they put in there. It's really good information. And even for established GMs like me, like I've been running for, I think, a decade now. And by running for a decade, I don't mean that oh, I've run a game or two a week for a little bit. I've run for maybe a dozen or so people. I have run for hundreds of players because I used to do the convention scene and I was a local coordinator, and I've written my own content. I've published my own D&D content. I am a really experienced game master, and I've run a bunch of different systems. There are things in here that I learned. And there's also, other cool stuff. Like they have one of the things I think in creating a scene is they have kind of a breakdown of how to do chases. I love chases in RPGs. I really, really do. I think they're a ton of fun. And they don't actually have to be, oh, we have to catch this person. You can use a chase design to do a lot of things. Like one of my favorite tropes to run into repeatedly is if you've ever played a Metroid game, after you kill the final boss, spoiler alert, something explodes and you have to run away every single time. There is not a single Metroid game that hasn't ended with warning, warning, explosion imminent, and then you have to run your ass off using all of your abilities to speedrun the last part of the game. It's always super fun. You can use a chase to effectively do that without having someone that you're catching, just escaping a burning building or something, or, that's a really fun thing. They have designs for that in here. So, and then Chapter 8 is an actual adventure. It's a short adventure. This is a one shot, and I think it only has like 3 scenes. So it's not a super involved thing, but if you're interested in running crossover stuff, like it's a perfect example of it. So as far as should GMs buy this, hell yes. Again, you're going to get the most out of this book if you already own the other 3 books. However, unlike the players where you really need at least 2 other books to actually get benefit out of this, to get the full benefit, you really don't for GMs. This is not... One of the things I thought this might be would just be kind of a generic Essence20 system book, kind of like the Cypher System core book. The Cypher System core book, which I did a Discovering New Dragons on. That in and of itself is just a generic, okay, here is this system and here's some examples of how you can use the system to create different kinds of adventures. I kind of thought that's what this was going to be. It's not. This is literally a guide on how to run adventures that are crossovers. Like, that's what it's for. And so you can't really use it. You can't use this to run Essence20 games on its own. There's not enough here. There's not enough of the Essence20 system here to be able to run a single game out of it. However, unlike for players where to get really any benefit out of it, you need at least 2 books. Because chapters 4 through 7 is just really, really good GM advice, you could actually get a lot out of this without owning 2 other books. You're probably going to need at least 1 other book because you need one of the other books to be able to run the Essence20 system because they have the base rules and how everything works. But even if you don't have any books, even if you never intend to run the Essence20 system, there is so much good material in here for both new and established GMs about how to run a table. They have a session 0, which I've made a rant about, just the kind of fanaticism we've attached to the idea of a session 0 where it cures all problems. It doesn't. They're useful, don't get me wrong. They're not essential. They really, really aren't. And all the people that are telling you, if you don't run session 0, that's a huge red flag and you shouldn't play with them. No. Session 0s are great tools, but that's exactly what they are. They are a tool that you should have in your GM toolbox, but using that tool on every single job you ever do, it's kind of like having a favorite sledgehammer. If every time you go to a work site you bring out your sledgehammer, sometimes it's going to be useful if you're doing demolition. However, if you're building a birdhouse and you bring out your sledgehammer, you're not going to build a birdhouse, you're going to break it. And that's kind of what I see session 0s are. So they have some tips on running session 0s. They make them seem like they're the be-all, end-all. They're not. But that's just the prevalent theme of the RPG community as a whole right now is we have to fetishize the idea of session 0s. And the information that they put in here, other than one real stupid thing, is good information. And then everything else, like creating threats, Yes, the threats in and of themselves are for Essence20, but a lot of the kind of theory crafting behind the threats is just good RPG advice. The same is true about creating scenes. Not all RPGs, and to be perfectly honest, it's a minority of RPGs that use a scene-based system. Like D&D has never used a scene-based system. However, it's really easy to introduce a scene-based system into any RPG. And for those of us that have grown up watching TV and movies and things like that, which is based on scenes and stuff like that, and theater as well, it's really, really easy to understand a scene-based organizational structure. So again, even if you're not going to run Essence20, the creating scene section has a lot of useful information you can use in other RPGs. The same thing is true about creating adventures. Again, all of these are geared specifically towards Essence20, specifically for Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, and Transformers. But there's so much other information in there that is just good advice on how to create adventures, how to create scenes and framing, how to create threats in general, how to create monsters and what they should do for your puppet players, that this book can stand on its own. GMs are still going to get the most benefit if they own at least one other book. And if you own all three already, this hands down is easy. Again, for the 55 plus shipping, this is a steal for GMs. If you're not a physical book kind of person, the PDF is also a really fantastic option for this. But I cannot recommend highly enough this as a book for GMs. It is such great information in there. Even if you're really experienced like me, or you've never sat in a GM table, chair before, there's so much you're going to get out of this, even if you're not running Essence20. Moving on. The third group. Should Lorehounds get this? And this is where I feel like the book stumbles a little bit. And technically, that's not really a bad thing. This book is designed from a purely mechanical standpoint. This book is designed to teach you how to basically use these three books together. And because, despite the fact that all three of those books are powered by Essence20, they are very different systems. It's one of the things I love about Essence20 is a G.I. Joe game feels completely different than a Power Rangers game. Playing, writing, and running, they just feel different. And I think it just kind of emphasizes the power of the Essence20 system. It's a really solid system where you can get games that feel very, very different, that use the same core features. And it's something that you don't see a lot in kind of your genre neutral systems. Like the Cypher system is one of the other kind of few systems where when you see like Numenera versus the Strange, they're going to feel familiar because they have very similar mechanics because they're using the same thing. But Numenera and the Strange have very, very different feels to them when you're playing them. And the same is true of Stars of Our Fire or any of the other kind of campaign settings. Essence20 goes a step further where they change and they add mechanics to the different systems that makes them very, very different. Because this is such a technical book, there's just not anywhere near as much lore in here. There is a little bit of lore. They have little introductions to each universe that kind of explains, the basic plot of the existence of that universe. And they do have kind of in-universe explanations for all of the mechanics, which is really essential. But in order to get to those things, you have to read through a lot of mechanics. And if you are not a mechanically minded person, if you don't play RPGs at all, this is going to be a very, very dry book. Again, if you are mechanically minded, if you're a Lorehound that also moonlights as a player, or moonlights as a GM every so often, this is going to be really, really fascinating. I really enjoyed just seeing all the really interesting things that exist. And they do introduce... so I finally figured out what factions are. Factions are... Power Rangers are a faction. G.I. Joe is a faction. Transformers are a faction. And when you're doing this kind of hybrid classing, it changes what abilities you get at first level based on your faction. They introduce a few new factions that are not Power Rangers, G.I. Joes, or Transformers that you can use to flavor your characters. And each one of those factions has their own little bit of lore. So there is lore in this book. It's just relatively limited compared to, like, this is a, this is like a 250 page plus book. And if you were to put all of the lore together and get rid of all the mechanics, you might have half a dozen to a dozen pages of lore in this 250 page book. There's just not a ton of it here. And again, that's not a mark against this book. That's not what this book was designed to do. That's like getting mad at Alice in Wonderland for not talking about quantum physics. It's not what the book's designed to do. It's an absurdist narrative that may or may not have something to do with Lewis Carroll's extreme distaste for theoretical mathematics. Which, if you ever want to read a deep dive that'll mess you up, look up Lewis Carroll and his feelings about theoretical math, because that made me view Alice in Wonderland in a completely different light. It's really interesting. So yeah, as far as do I recommend this for Lorehounds, I really don't. A lot of the information you can get in here, you can get in one of the 3 books, other than the faction info. Which, as far as I can tell, these are factions that were created specifically for the RPG. They are exclusive for here, but $55 plus shipping is just way too much for a few pages of some new factions, in my personal opinion. And even the PDF, I have a hard time recommending it to a pure Lorehound. If you moonlight as a player or a GM, or you think you might start wanting to get into playing, then go to one of those other sections and figure out if it sounds like it's good enough for you in there. But as far as Lorehounds, I just really don't recommend this book to Lorehounds. There's just not enough here to justify the purchase. If you can find it on sale later on down the road, or maybe find it on Amazon, because they always have cheap prices on Amazon, maybe then I could see justifying maybe $20 for this book for a Lorehound. But anything more than that, and it's just probably not going... You're not going to feel good about purchasing it if you're exclusively a Lorehound. So, yeah, moving on. So, quick recap for players. It is recommended to pick up this book if you own at least 2 other Essence20 books. If you don't, you're not going to get your money's worth out of this. For GMs, it's just recommended that you pick up the book. It's a good book. You're going to get more benefit if you own at least one other Essence20 book. If you own all 3 Essence20 books right now, you're going to get a lot of use out of this. And then for Lorehounds, it's just not really recommended. There's not enough lore here to really justify making a $65 or $70 purchase of a physical book, or like a $30 or $40 purchase of a PDF for the amount of lore that's in here. That being said, I think it's time for us to get into the in-depth review. For anyone that came here just for a recommendation, thank you for tuning in. Again, remember to like, subscribe, turn notifications on in the comments down below. What are you most excited to see in a crossover? Do you want, to see Power Rangers fighting alongside Transformers? Do you think G.I. Joes would have interesting interactions with the Power Rangers? Or do you want to see a triple threat where all 3 teams have to fight against Megatron and Lord Zed and Zartan all at the same time? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, let's get that in-depth review. As a reminder, my in-depth reviews are exactly that. They are in-depth. I'm going to talk about the things that I like, the things that I don't like, things I think they did well, the things that I think they need to do better. I'm going to go chapter by chapter, sometimes page by page. I will have timestamps so that you can come back and watch this in shifts, but this is going to get in depth. It's the whole point of this thing. So, let's start this off. Chapter 1. Introduction to Action and Adventure. This is kind of your standard how to use this book chapter. However, with just the scope of this book, I have never seen a book try to merge campaign settings before, especially with how diverse. Like, these aren't different campaign settings; they are different games that just happen to share similar things. The same could be said about Powered by the Apocalypse games. I have never seen a Powered by the Apocalypse book where it goes, well, this is how you can merge Avatar Legends with masks. So normally this first chapter is something like, well, you can kind of skip over it. If you're experienced with, running RPGs, this is for new people. This book is not designed for new people, and therefore this first chapter is actually really useful. It does give you an overview of what each chapter tells you, and they're good overviews. I read through this. I read just about everything in this chapter. A lot of other places I'll kind of skim and just look at specific highlights, so it doesn't take me 4 years to make one of these in-depth reviews. But I read through this entire section a couple of times because it's a really, really good explanation of what you're going to see. Excuse me. And with how just mechanics heavy and text heavy this book is, having idea of what you're going to be seeing before you see it is almost essential. There's just so much. This is a really, really text heavy book and mechanics heavy book that it can get overwhelming very quickly. So I highly recommend at least read on page 6. It says, what's in this book? And it goes from the second half of page 6 to the first half of page 7. It's real short. It's like a dozen paragraphs. Read that entire thing. Even if you don't read anything else in this section, read that entire thing because it's going to help you kind of get your mind set for, okay, this is what I'm going to be seeing. If you don't do that, you might get lost pretty quick in here because there's a lot. Then they have a section on each one of these settings. It starts with the world of Power Rangers, where it kind of talks about the kind of basis of the world itself, and this is the lore. And then it has another section called the Power Rangers setting, where it talks a little bit more about themes that you're going to be dealing with when you're running Power Rangers based games and stuff like that. Same thing is true for the world of G.I. Joe, and then G.I. Joe setting, and then the world of Transformers and the Transformers setting. And then they have a section called Crossing Over, where again, it's really meant to give you an idea of how a crossover works from a kind of, not just mechanical standpoint, but from a story writing standpoint. This is something that, depending on the game master that you're talking to, they will either put a very large emphasis on the idea of proper story structure and understanding how to write conflict and things like that. Like, understanding the writing process does 100% every single time makes you a better game master. Anyone that tells you otherwise is saying that to convince themselves, not to convince anyone else. Do you need to study story writing and to be a good game master? Absolutely not. There are tons of really great game masters that have never learned story writing whatsoever, or the building blocks of stories in general. However, it is a useful tool for every game master. And that kind of is what it goes into here. If you are kind of a writing guru, you're going to see, they're not going to use a lot of writing terms in here. Like, you won't see denouement anywhere. But they do go into kind of the nitty gritty of, plot points and stuff that you would learn in school without using all the terms in that and without getting too specific. And it gives really, really good kind of examples of like the why of why a crossover would happen. Because that's something that a lot of game masters can have difficulties with, is the why of, well, why are my players doing this? Why are they working together? So the why, I mentioned this before, one of my rules of training is the why is more important than the what. And this does a lot of the why. And it talks about, what are the goals of the crossover? How are they going to get along? Because due to the fact that G.I. Joe is effectively special forces and they're effectively military. Power Rangers are superheroes. They generally have no military training. They generally are going to be kind of wild cards. So a group that is built on a chain of command and very military structure running into a team that is very much kind of fly by the seat of their pants and they don't have a structure and things like that, there's going to be conflicts built into that. And the same thing is going to happen when you have giant alien robots that can turn into cars just showing up. So I like the fact that they kind of acknowledge that just because you're running a crossover doesn't mean that they're automatically going to be like, oh, look, my friend, let me give you a hug. No, there should be some conflict when they start dealing with each other. And that might go through the entire thing. I think a really great example from Power Rangers is just how the Time Force Rangers and the Silver Guardians, which is basically a military force, created as an answer to the Power Rangers, because the Power Rangers had no chain of command. They don't answer to anyone. Silver Guardians are part of the military, or they technically were private security, but they were a civilian group. And they even created their own Ranger powers in the Quantum Ranger. That kind of dichotomy of, the military style people are going to have conflicts with the non-military style people, and other stuff like that. Like, they go into the specifics here, and I think that's kind of cool. As quickly as it starts, it's over. It's only about 10. It's only about 10 pages, but it's a really kind of information dense 10 pages. So, moving on. Chapter 2: Crossover Character Creation. This is where the game designer in me had a bit of an aneurysm. It's kind of intense, just the amount of stuff that they put in here. The artwork, by the way, they have all this crossover artwork that just looks amazing. Like on the second page of Chapter 2, they have this big artwork where you can see Optimus Prime and I think it's one of the Dinobots in the background, fighting against Megatron and Soundwave and all that. And then as you look, you can see like Lady J going around and Snake Eyes jumping onto a Decepticon with his, with his Uzi and his katana out, and then Roadblock's there, and like it's really cool. You can see Cobra Commander and Baron something. The Baroness, that's what it is. The Baroness are all that. Like, it's a really cool piece of art that just shows everything. There's no Power Rangers in that one, but they do have like triple crossover artwork too. So the artwork, they reuse a lot of artwork from the other books, and then they also put some. I'm assuming this is custom artwork, because something somebody else told me in one of my reviews is they do take very heavily inspiration from the comics. Like, a lot of the artwork that you find in a lot of these books is taken directly from the comic books, which is not a bad thing. The comic artists are brilliant and amazing. However, I don't know of a G.I. Joe Transformers crossover that they would have gotten this artwork from, so I'm assuming that a lot of this artwork is custom made for this book, which I think is great and amazing. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments down below. Again, I know some of the Renegade staff, at least one member of the Renegade staff, watches my videos. So if I'm wrong about this, let me know. But I believe a lot of this artwork is custom, and it's great. So the first thing they do, they have Essence20 character creation, and this, I hate to use this phraseology because it's not technically this, but the easiest way to understand it is this is how you min-max an Essence20 character. And that's not what it is, but this does give you kind of tips on how to create strong Essence20 characters. They talk about things like overlapping skills, the fact that one of the subtitles is called "You Are Not Alone," so you don't have to be good at everything. Let other players have things that they're good at, and you specialize in the things that you do well. But this whole first section is basically how to build strong Essence 20 characters in general. And I don't think I've ever seen a book from a publisher do this. Like I've never seen Wizards of the Coast give a guide to, creating, strong 5th edition characters and what kind of stats and things that you want to focus and emphasize. They do D&D Beyond puts out videos about, this is how you build an Eldritch Knight and stuff like that. But it's not the same as this. Like, this is a really, really good guide for, okay, you want the nitty gritty, you want to know the things that you need to be looking at. This is the stuff that you generally would learn just by playing. Things like perception checks in D&D are really, really useful. Insight is a really useful ability. Things like that, whereas something like history is very rarely used. That's stuff that you just learn from playing games. And this first section is kind of like all the stuff that you just learn from playing games, which kind of makes sense because, again, as far as I'm aware, the team at Renegade that actually writes the Essence 20 books also playtest them themselves. I believe they have other playtesters as well, but they've made mention many, many times that they actually play these games. So it kind of makes sense that they would know the system well enough after playing it so many times to be able to tell you, okay, these are the things that you need. Like, one of the things they talk about is overlapping skills, and they basically talk about the fact that might and finesse, you very rarely, if ever, need to have ranks in both might and finesse. Because most weapons that you can use might with, you can also use finesse with, or there is a version of the weapon that you can use finesse with it. So it's very rare that you will ever need a character that is trained in both. And so they have other stuff in here like that as well. So I think it's interesting. Like I said, I've never seen... I've seen tons of YouTube channels. I've done it myself. That's what D&D Deep Dive was. I've seen YouTube channels and fans come up with, okay, this is how you build a strong character. Never seen the writers themselves actually put it into one of their books. So I think that's kind of interesting and cool. The next thing they talk about is expanding your character with existing options. And this is where they start talking about, okay, this is how we're going to start taking stuff from one game and putting it into another. The first section is going to be talking about universal elements and flavor and stuff like that. This is all stuff that you don't really need this book for, but it's nice that they pointed out in here. They talk about things like avoiding the domino effect, which is basically, you need to look at some of these things. If you change something, but you don't think about what other things that impacts, you're going to have problems. The thing that they bring up here is that Transformers Origins have higher health than the Origins for G.I. Joes and the Origins for Power Rangers, because G.I. Joes have the Go Joe perk, and Power Rangers have its Morphin Time, which changes how they play. So you need to understand the whole package before you start changing things. And that's a really useful thing. Then they also have a section specifically called "This Version is Obviously Better." And I like the fact that they bring this to the forefront, because this is something that you see it on D&D Reddit constantly. Excuse me. Where basically what it is you have people going, well, why would you ever take this ability when this ability does everything that one does but better? And at least in 5th edition D&D, it's extremely rare for that to actually be a true statement. It's generally because people don't understand what the abilities do, and they just say, well, this ability only does this. Well, no, it does the other things too. Well, I don't care about those other things. This is the only reason I would take it. And because the only reason I would take this ability is for this, I'm going to choose this other ability because it lets me do that better. Well, that's the entire point of the other ability, is if that's your only purpose in it, then yes, it is better. That's why. So they do have a little thing where it goes, hey, if you think something is obviously better, probably isn't. But there might be a few things, because again, we're dealing with 3 different games here, that are, let your GM make decisions and things like that. If there is a quote-unquote obviously better thing, you're allowed to rebalance things now that you're merging 3 different RPGs into one. So I like the fact that they put that in. And then simple crossover character creation. This is when they start showing how things work. And they start with the influences because the influences are really, really easy to kind of shift over. They require very little mechanical changes. It's mostly just flavor. So to give an example, they talk about Power Rangers influences and how they work in other systems. So they start with the Artisan. And then they have 3 bullet points in Power Rangers and G.I. Joe and Transformers. So the Artisan in Power Rangers. Having a creative side can help process the stress of constant battle against evil. So that's how the Artisan fits into the Power Rangers universe. In G.I. Joe, hobbies are a good way for a Joe to spend their downtime and help with rehabilitation if a mission went awry. So that's how an Artisan would exist in G.I. Joe. And then in Transformers, Cybertronians are just as likely to have creative skills and need to express themselves. Appreciating local art is also a way to understand alien culture. So the influences section is basically mostly lore-based. Is, okay, this is how you can make these different influences fit into these different games. Because a lot of times, like they mention specifically, Power Rangers are generally going to be teenagers and young adults. So their influences a lot of times are going to have to do with being a student or being young and kind of coming into the role that you plan to fill in society as a large. Whereas like G.I. Joes are adults, and most G.I. Joes, being a G.I. Joe is their second job that they've had. They had an entire career before, and then they changed careers to become a Joe. And so because of that, their influences are very different. And then Cybertronians, you're basically talking about what did you do on the other planet before you got exiled here. So they do kind of make mention of they're different on purpose, but there's easy ways to kind of make them fit in the other places. So this whole section, again, it goes through every influence in each one of the core books without explaining the influence itself, but showing how you can adapt it to the different settings. It's really, really good. Overall, I think it's really, really well done. Next, they go for general perks, and this one is even shorter, where they basically put general perks from each one of the books into 3 basic categories. You have universal, adaptable, and setting specific, which basically means universal ones, you can just use them. So like for Power Rangers, the Garage Band is considered a universal general perk. So you could be G.I. Joe with a Garage Band perk or a Transformer with a Garage Band perk, and it really doesn't require any kind of modification other than making it fit in your story. Adaptable is things that technically they can work. You're going to have to make some adjustments to it to fit. Their specific explanation they have here: adaptable. Applicable to characters from other settings, but require the GM to create or explain aspects of the flavor or adjust benefits specific to the general perks setting. So it might be that the adaptable ones have things that kind of interact a little bit more with, for Power Rangers, for example, they interact a little bit more with morphing, and that's something that's exclusive to Power Rangers. So adaptable is stuff that you can work, but you have to kind of change. Setting specific are stuff that only works for those settings. Like for Power Rangers, extra grid power, because Power Rangers are the only roles that get grid power are Power Rangers roles. You really can't take that perk in any other setting because it's not going to give you anything. Not just because you don't have grid power, but you also have no way to use grid power as a G.I. Joe. And they specifically put all the grid powers are setting specific. You can't really use them in other settings because they're completely tied to being a Power Ranger. And the same thing for G.I. Joe. You have universal, adaptable, and setting specific. The funny thing about G.I. Joe is for setting specific for Power Rangers, there's a decent list. Like it's almost as long as the universal. For setting specific for G.I. Joe, it is 1. And that is split focus. Which, if I remember correctly, just allows you to kind of multi-class focuses effectively. Which is kind of a uniquely G.I. Joe thing, because while Transformers do have focuses as well, it's slightly different. So I thought that was that was interesting, is that so much of the GI Joe stuff is universal, and there's literally only one general perk from GI Joe that you can't really use with the other settings. I find that interesting. And then for Transformers, again, they have universal, adaptable, setting specific, and the setting specific for Transformers is, again, things like additional alt mode, size change, things like that are really built around Transformers in general, and won't work for Power Rangers because Power Rangers don't have an alternate form, things like that. And then they have a final section where they talk about equipment. And they basically say, like, equipment is universal. You can do anything. The one difference is the G.I. Joe role-player RPG, because the G.I. Joes don't have any kind of quote-unquote extraordinary abilities, like Power Rangers. All their grid powers and anything that uses grid power points are going to let them do things that humans can't. And the same thing is true about anything that uses Energon points for Transformers, and a lot of their stuff is just fantastical. So because of that, the G.I. Joe RPG just has more options for weapons and stuff like that. None of it is unbalanced if you use it in any other game. It's just that's why there's more stuff for the G.I. Joe. Is they kind of just mention that's why there's more stuff in the G.I. Joe. Doesn't mean that you can't use any of that stuff. We're just telling you the why behind the what. There's none of it's unbalanced. It's just, it feels better for G.I. Joes to have more options. Then we get to advanced crossover character creation. This is where they start talking about origins and how to get different origins. This one, I still don't understand it 100%. Simply because specifically dealing with origins, with alt modes, effectively all the Transformers origins, it's really, really different because they're just built differently. They have an entire section that talks about how to deal with origins with alt modes and different things. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me, despite the fact that I have read it over a few times. But overall, they have rules for it. It's intense, to say the least. And then they do the same thing with origins that they did with influences, where they go Power Rangers origins. Athletic. In Power Rangers, a lot of Power Ranger candidates are mindful of good bodily health. This is reflected in many of the characters that later devote their lives to being defenders of the morphing grid. So that's how athletic works in Power Rangers. For G.I. Joe, boot camp is hard on a recruit, and training to be a Joe can be made more successful if you start out with a life of physical activity and skills. In Transformers, even Cybertronians benefit from practice physical motions and activities. This is especially appropriate for Cybertronians with animalistic modes, whether in bot mode like Ravage or alt mode like Swoop. So yeah, basically just this is how all these origins exist in the other things. And again, they do it for G.I. Joe. They do it for Transformers. And again, Transformers is the one that is the most unique because of the alt mode. But it all works, and it's interesting. And then they go into roles. And this is where I have kind of a complaint with how they classify one of the roles. So, for the roles... And this is where they start talking about factions and things like that, because this is how you're going to change. This is how you're going to change, like a Green Ranger into a Transformer or something like that. Is through faction perks and setting perks. We'll talk about those in a second. But what they do is they actually create categories for the different roles, and the categories they create are Defender, Team Leader, Damage Dealer, Expert, and Wild Card. And for Defender, for Power Rangers, we have the Green Ranger. And to me, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. To be perfectly honest, a Defender role for Power Rangers doesn't really exist in the core book. Again, one of my alternate names for the the new roles in Power Rangers is the Gold Ranger is the Defender, because that is a very defense-oriented thing, whereas the other, like G.I. Joe and Transformers, all have kind of a defense-oriented role. So I'm not a fan of them calling the Green Ranger a defender, because 100% Green Ranger is not a defender. The Green Ranger is a solo attacker, and that's what it's been pitched as. That's how it works. Other than that, it makes sense, and it kind of shows you, like, for team leaders, Black and Red Rangers both tend to make pretty good team leaders from a mechanic standpoint. For G.I. Joe, Officer tends to be the team leader, and for Transformers, the Field Commander tends to be the team leader. And then the Expert is the one that's most interesting, because Blue Ranger is the expert of the Power Rangers, but Analyst is the expert for Transformers, and the Analyst is really a heavy support class. I would almost compare the Analyst more with a Black Ranger than I would with the Blue Ranger, but it all makes sense. So factions and setting perks, basically, when you build a character, which if you've been watching my channel for the past few weeks, we've been building Power Rangers, and all Power Rangers come we've been doing Power Rangers. I don't know why my brain just said no. But they all come with the It's Morphin Time perk, which I never wrote on my character sheet, because that's how it works for all Power Rangers. Well, I'm just going to read what they have here, because they explain it a lot better than I'm going to. Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, and Transformers roles each feature a first-level perk shared by all roles in their core rulebook. It's Morphin Time in Power Rangers, Yo-Joe in G.I. Joe, and For the Allspark in Transformers. Additionally, they all have perks specific to their role under a special banner. Power Rangers has Personal Power, G.I. Joe has Be a Hero, and Transformers has Cybertronian Perk. These first-level perks shared across multiple roles are known as faction perks. Other examples of factions include Cobra, Dinobots, and the new factions introduced in Chapter 3, like the Earth Defense Command. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So if you're going to be switching roles, you have to a different faction. So like G.I. Joe is a different faction. If you're going to take a Green Ranger and turn him into a G.I. Joe, then you have to change the faction perks and the setting perks. And they specifically talk about how to change factions so that the role will work in the new setting, and you're not going to feel like a total fish out of water. And they talk about settings. In addition to faction perks, each role includes special rules to further customize characters and tie them to their settings. These are called setting perks. Power Rangers give players Zords and Grid powers as setting perks. G.I. Joe and Transformers give player focus options as setting perks. So the focus option for G.I. Joe and Transformers is considered a setting perk, whereas the Zords and Grid powers are considered the setting perk of Rangers. So if you take a Transformers role and turn it into a Power Ranger, they're going to lose their faction perks, for the Allspark, and then they're also going to lose their setting perks, which means you're not going to be able to choose a focus, and you're also going to lose your Cybertronian perk. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not just simply, take this out and put this in. And so they actually have a section for each game setting. So removing the Power Rangers faction and settings, it specifically tells you what you need to do. Removing the G.I. Joe faction settings. And then there's another one that's adding the Power Rangers factions and settings. So if you are taking a Power Ranger and turning them into a G.I. Joe, the first thing you do is you go to removing the Power Ranger settings and you follow what's there. And then you would go adding the G.I. Joe factions and settings, and then you do what it says there. So the rules are a little bit complicated. And again, I haven't played a crossover adventure, so I can't 100% tell you that, yes, this is well balanced and it works. But from everything I'm reading here, everything makes sense to me. And doing my own bits of research and my own understanding of the game, this feels like it should work well. Until I run one of these things, I can't 100% tell you it's going to work and you're not going to have any problems. But with not just the complexity of it, because remarkably enough, it's actually not that complex. It's actually relatively it's relatively simple. There's just very specific things you have to do for each one. And it's not like a one size fits all. Like each setting you have to do different things, but they're not really, really advanced, like recalculating anything. It's just take this out, put this in. And there's different rules for each setting, but for the most part, take something out, put something in, and you're done. It's remarkably, it's deceptively simple. Let's put it that way. And so everything here, as far as I understand, it looks like it works real well. And it's impressive to me because I couldn't come up with a way to turn a Transformer into a Power Ranger. Like, I thought about different ways to do it, but it was going to be really complicated. It was going to take me a lot of time to do. And this is a really, really quick, simple, easy way to do it where I don't have to put in, hours and hours and hours of time basically creating a new role in order for someone to be able to use a Transformers role in Power Rangers. And it's impressive to me that all of the... Because I've thought about doing this. And I tried to come up with my own ways, and they were always very complicated and very annoying and would require me to basically re-engineer something from scratch. And this isn't. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. It's almost insulting to me just how simple this is. And it's probably because they wrote the system and intended for this to be something that you do. So it was designed to do this. But yeah, it seems like it works, and it's really impressive to me that they could do this. Again, especially since the systems are so different, and this just works. And then they go over each role and go, okay, like for the Black Ranger and Power Rangers. Affable Warrior, Black Rangers keep morale high while taking the fight to the enemy. A capable combatant that's also one part leader and one part healer, the Black Ranger fills in a need no matter what the group they join. In G.I. Joe, focusing on supporting others, Black Rangers pair nicely with the Officer and Vanguard focus options, because you do get to pick a focus if you become a G.I. Joe or a Transformer. Depending on whether you want to be a fighter who looks out for teammates or a leader who can handle in a fight. And then in Transformers, in the middle of a millennia-long civil war with no end in sight, the Autobots could use an ally who makes them laugh. Mechanically, Black Rangers fit well with field commanders and warriors, but thematically, the Black Ranger is exactly what the Autobots need. So again, this is lore reasons for why this will work. And then the mechanical stuff they introduced first, which I think is a good idea. They do this for every single role, including the White Ranger. And then G.I. Joe, same thing. Commando, Renegade, this is how it works. Transformers, same thing. So, like, to give you an example, Field Commander for Power Rangers. Every squad needs a leader. It's why each setting has at least one role dedicated to the concept, and why each of these roles was built a little differently. Field Commanders are more formal in theme, but the issue command perk also allows for fun narrative moments. Field Commander, for me personally, is one of my favorite Transformers roles, because in 4th edition, they introduced a martial leader. And what that means, classes in 4th edition had two things. You had a power source, and you had a role that you filled. The power sources were Martial, Primal, and Divine. And they also had Psionic, and eventually they added Dark, or Shadow. But it started off with Martial, which is weapons-based class. Primal, which is nature. Divine, which is that, I think Arcane was one, so magic stuff. And then, obviously, Psionics was monks and all that stuff. And then the roles, you had Defender, you were the tank. Striker, you did damage. Controller, you controlled the battlefield. And then leaders were the healers. And so a martial healer was effectively a strength-based healer, and that was the Battle Master. I think the Warlord is what he was called. There we go. And the Warlord, one of the things that it could do is it could just give out actions to other people. Instead of taking its own action, it would go, I don't want to make an attack. Why don't you make an attack? And that character could use one of their powers, and it was really, really useful. That's kind of what the Field Commander does, depending on how you build them. And I just love that style of player. I created one of my subclasses for the Dragon Knight, the one that uses the Dragon Tail. Thank you, phone. The one that has the dragon tail that I can't remember the name of, is a kind of Battle Master, Warlord style character that can give out attacks to other players. So I just like the fact that there would be a Power Ranger that gives out commands. I think that's a cool idea. So, and then they have sample crossover characters, which I think is really really important. Just to kind of give okay, we've given all of this information. Let's show you what it looks like when you actually do it. And so it's really nice. They create a cool character, a Transformer Power Ranger, which I think is kind of interesting. And yeah, that's it's chapter 2. Moving on. I'm out of my ginger beer, so now I switch to water. Chapter 3. New crossover options. So this chapter is, they add some new stuff. So this is where we have new influences. So you have things like Cybertronian military, Cybertronian with attitude. So it's all of these things are meant to be kind of influences that are based on two different things. So like Cybertronian military is technically designed to be a G.I. Joe Transformer. Cybertronian with attitude is a G.I. Joe Power Ranger. Now, again, these are influences, so really anyone can take them. And because the influences have the least amount of impact on the kind of mechanics that are exclusive to each system, you don't generally have as much problem using an influence from another system with any other system. It's not nearly as hard. And there's lots of really great artwork in here as well that I just adore. And then they this is interesting. So they do have a Stargazer influence, which is the same name as one of the influences in the new Power Rangers book, but it's actually a different influence and has a different influence perk that I'm aware of, because the Power Rangers one is meant to be for Alien Rangers. So that I found really interesting, unless I'm just misremembering what Stargazer is in the new book. But it looks like something different. So yeah, that's cool. And then they do Origins, which again are designed to be kind of crossover things. Like one of them is an android, so it's designed to be, you know, robotic plus something else. They have a grid thropologist, which is someone that is gifted in grid tech and stuff like that, which I just find really really interesting. And then they have one called the Pretender, which is basically a transformer that I think their alt form is basically they try to look like a human, which again I find really interesting. Then they add this one called Strategist, which is again kind of a thing for all of them. Then they add a new role, the Envoy. And the Envoy, again, is interesting in the idea that it's designed to work in all three settings. So, like the starting role perks for the Envoy. For faction role perks, you understand others on a level few can compete with and are often accepted as an honorary member of groups you associate with. Choose two factions, such as Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, or Autobots. You gain the faction benefits of both factions. You don't need to be an official member of the faction to gain the faction benefits. So, for their faction benefits, they get two of them, and that's part of how their class is built, or their role is built, which I think is really interesting and crazy. And then they have three focuses: Alien Ambassador, Grid Psychic, and Military Attaché. Alien Ambassador is meant to fit best in a Transformers campaign. Grid Psychic is meant to fit best in a Power Rangers campaign, and Military Attaché is meant to fit best in a G.I. Joe campaign. However, because again, the faction benefits, like faction benefit for Power Rangers is it's morphin time. So theoretically, if you were to choose Military Attaché, but you also chose in morphin time, it's morphin time as one of your faction benefits, then you theoretically could be a ranger that is working with the GI Joes and things like that. Like there's so much interesting stuff built into this Envoy class that it would take me hours to go through everything and really look at. Like if I was to do a D&D deep dive, like an Essence20 deep dive kind of thing on the Envoy, it would be an hour and a half or 2 hour long episode easily, just with how much interaction that can occur. And then after the Envoy, they talk about new factions. And this is where things get real interesting. Because again, thus far, we have talked about factions as Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, and Transformers. And each different faction has their own RPG. But they introduce a few more factions that aren't tied to a specific one. And, yeah, that means that everything about it gets that much more interesting, especially when you're dealing with the Envoy that can just take one of these faction benefits as theirs. So, like, Earth Defense Command, I believe, is meant to interact most with, like, the lore behind it is they deal with Autobots and the Cybertronians in general. Gridlock is the Silver Guardians, effectively. It is a paramilitary organization. And they specifically talk about the Silver Guardians in here. But they're actual military as opposed to Silver Guardians, which is a private defense force. So that faction is designed to work best with the Power Rangers. And they specifically get access to grid tech and stuff like that. So a Gridlock could work very, very well on a Power Rangers team. They just wouldn't get the It's Morphin Time benefit. But very similar to, again, I'm going to bring up Time Force because it works that way. The Silver Guardians, and specifically Eric, even before he got his Quantum Morpher, dealt with the Power Rangers and regularly kind of helped them out without that. And you do have non-Power Ranger allies that show up regularly in Power Rangers. So Gridlock is just a really easy way to kind of introduce a non-Power Ranger Power Ranger effectively. From a lore perspective, it's really cool. And then Morformer is another one that's weird. And this one is another one that's kind of a combination. I guess Earth Defense Command is kind of a combination of G.I. Joe and Transformers. Gridlock is G.I. Joe and Power Rangers. And then Morformer is kind of Transformers and Power Rangers kind of thing. So all these factions are meant to be kind of hybrids of two different things. Everything about it is interesting. Like, I would love to do an entire thing just on the factions. I don't know if I'd ever have the time or the ability to do it, but it's really interesting stuff. And this massively adds so much customizability to any game. And again, if you don't want Transformers in your Power Rangers games, you can still use the perks themselves and just take out references to Transformers and come up with unique, interesting stuff. And then they add some new general perks, which is just cool stuff. Again, these are just more perks that allow you to kind of blend and mix things. Like one of them is Be a Hero. Pick a G.I. Joe role. You gain the benefit of that role's Be a Hero perk, including any cost associated with it. So you can just use this pick to effectively kind of multi-class into other systems roles. It's really, really cool. Just everything about it is cool. I like it. And they have pets. Like you can get robot animal pets and Zord Ultra. That's one of my favorite new perks is Zord Ultra Mode. Basically, if you want to make a Power Ranger that's a Transformer, instead of them calling a Zord, because Zords are a huge part, you can take this perk called Zord Ultra Mode and you transform. You basically get another alternate mode where you transform into your Zord and you get all the perks of your Zord, but you can still Like, you just effectively grow, like Magic Wand make my monster grow, your Transformer grows, and they can still transform between bot mode and alt mode, but still get all the benefits of all their Zord perks. It is the weirdest thing I have ever heard, and everything about it I love. Everything about it I love. I think it's amazing. I think it's wonderful. It's so cool. So yeah, that's the end of chapter 3. Moving on. Chapter 4. Action Adventure Game Masters. This is your how to GM thing. And again, if you're a new GM or an established GM, someone that has a lot of experience, there's a lot of decent stuff in here. My one big problem, and again, I'm going to put the emphasis on, I understand why you did this. It was a mistake. You are going to get in trouble for this. I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to get in trouble for this. Page 77. This is the second page of chapter 4. There's a big red box. It's entitled World Building Without Bias. I'm going to read it in its entirety. Forgive me if I'm breaking some sort of copyright. I think this is, this is being done specifically for commentary, and I want you guys to understand exactly what is said here. So I am claiming fair use on this, which you actually can't do because claim fair use is actually an affirmative defense, and so you can't claim fair use until you've actually been sued. I understand all the legalese. The reason I'm going to read the entirety of this is that you need to understand why this is such a bad idea. So, world building without bias. When designing scenes and adventures, you, the GM, are engaged in world building. Your choice of whom you put in those scenes and what they're doing communicate how your world functions to those players. Strive for world building without racist or other bias. Historical accuracy is not an excuse, given the fact that we are dealing with games where fantastical things occur. Even accuracy to the original show and toys isn't an excuse. Many of them were created long ago and don't reflect the real group of people who are playing these games today. I disagree with that. We'll come back to it. Please be aware that most of the time, world builders have a completely unconscious tendency to make most people in the world look like themselves. Take some time to look at your NPCs and do some simple counting. Are about half your NPCs women? If not, they should be. You might need to revise your ideas and make sure that your NPCs include women. Are a significant portion of your NPCs described as having skin colors other than white? Among many people, if skin color isn't described, it is assumed to be white, so describe white and non-white skin tones equally. Consider incorporating the broad spectrum of humanity into your game by specifically describing NPCs' skin color as tawny, golden brown, pale pink, amber, coppery, topaz, warm beige, or rich umber. As a rule, do not use food items as color choices. Many consider it demeaning. Investigate the blog writingwithcolor.tumblr.com for more advice. Never link to Tumblr. That's a massively dumb idea. People who use mobility devices like wheelchairs, LGBT plus folks, neurodivergent people, fat people, and others are important parts of the human community that should be seen as powerful, cool, and vital parts of your game. Look at your opposition forces and ask, are they all from the same group? If so, they should also be diversified. If the only fat person in your campaign is the bad guy, then that says some very biased things about fat people. Take an honest look at your plot. Is it exploitative of minority groups or culturally appropriative? Read up on world building advice from notable professionals in the field, like, I'm going to say this name wrong, I think it's Graeme Barber, Graeme, and Tanya DePass, to help make your world more vibrant, interesting, and fair. This is woke points. Completely understand why you put it in there. And a lot of you probably believe this is good advice. It's really stupid advice. You want to know why? There was an article, I think, from the New York Times, but it might have been from someone else. It makes sense for it to be the New York Times. I don't remember. The article was talking about how if you use GIFs on Twitter that primarily have people of color in them reacting to something, and you are white, you are using digital blackface. I want you to think about that for a second. If you use a GIF as a reaction, and the people in the GIF don't look like you, then you are performing digital blackface. Do you understand how massively moronic that statement is? The reason I bring it up is not that they're saying anything or I'm somehow associating that with Renegade. This is a really stupid idea, because if you are white, like me, and you add people of color to your adventures just so that you can have people of color in there, you are going to be accused of blackface or cultural appropriation. Something. You're going to be accused of it. If you start adding in people from the LGBTQ plus spectrum, just because you don't have enough of it in there, you're going to be accused of tokenism. This is the dumbest advice I have ever heard. You do not look over all your characters and make sure that enough of them tick the right box. Because what you're going to do is you're not going to take the time to do what you should be doing, which is learn about other cultures, be inspired by other cultures, and celebrate other cultures in all of your creative works. But that is not something that can be done in 4 paragraphs in a pink box. That is an incredibly difficult, long process. And even if you do everything exactly the right way, you are going to be attacked for it, because that is how the internet works right now. You are going to be attacked for something. They will find a way to attack you for something. And it doesn't matter if you are a minority or if you're white or anything. They will find a way to attack you, because you cannot be a part of every single minority group. Do not, under any circumstance, lay all of your NPCs out and go, not enough of these people are people of color. Guess what? There are a lot of places all around the world where one particular group of people that all tends to look about the same tend to congregate together. That's how the world works. And this thing about historical accuracy, it's not historical accuracy, because we're not talking about the past. We're talking about right now. You are allowed to have worlds where your world reflects you and your group. If your group is diverse, then by all means, make your world diverse. If your group tends to all look the same, then if you go out of your way to add things without taking the proper steps of understanding the culture behind it and understanding the history of how that culture has been represented in other mediums, specifically by white people, because let's be honest, we don't have a good track record. You are going to fuck things up massively, and you're going to be crucified over it. And I know this is they specifically investigate the blog writingwithcolor.tumblr.com. There are blogs that will tell you this is what you're supposed to do. You will still get crucified for it. This is absolutely stupid, idiotic advice. I understand why they did it. It's really, really bad advice, because people are going to use this to claim that you are encouraging cultural appropriation, despite the fact that you specifically talk about don't do cultural appropriation. They're going to say that you're encouraging tokenism and all this other stuff. This is really, really bad advice. The advice you should give is, hey, your experience of the world is remarkably limited. It doesn't matter how far around the world you have traveled. There's 7.5 billion people in the world. There's 187 or 192 some odd different countries. The most traveled person in the world has not experienced a fraction of what is out there. Even something like, I live in Wisconsin. Madison and Milwaukee The two largest cities in Madison, Milwaukee, and Green Bay, three largest cities in Wisconsin. Each one is massively different. The cultures are completely different. The makeup of the people there is completely different. The things that they do for fun, completely different. The things that they really enjoy, the things that they celebrate, completely different. And to go from Milwaukee to Madison, it is a 1 hour drive. To go from Milwaukee to Green Bay, I think it's like 2 or 3 hours. They are really, really close, and they are completely different worlds. And I've been to all three cities. And I spent significant amount of time in all three cities. And that's just 3 cities. The world is very, very different all over. And it doesn't matter what you do, you are never going to understand the entirety of the world. So, when your players are going to different parts of your world, your world should not be the same everywhere. You know, if you look at the Forgotten Realms, Waterdeep and Neverwinter are massively different cities. Baldur's Gate, massively different cities. They have different people in them. They have different motivations. That's what you should strive to do. And yes, the idea of all of your people being whites is a bad idea. However, simply adding in skin tones because, well, I don't have enough, is a bad idea, because you are going to lean into tropes and stereotypes, and it's gonna get you in trouble 100% of the time. Trust me on this. I've been on the receiving end of it. It's not fun. This is monumentally stupid. Do not listen to any of this advice. What you should do, broaden your palette. Watch movies in different languages about different cultures. Understand not only those cultures as much as you can, but how they have been portrayed in Western society, specifically white-dominated Western society, and understand what some of the pitfalls are. It is unbelievably complicated and a lot of work to have an actually diverse world, but it's doable. You just have to put a lot of work into it. But this idea of, well, if not all of your people are, if not half of your NPCs are women, then no. Because very quickly, you can get in trouble for portraying your females without using a voice for them. Because you're like, well, how do we know that they're female? You're just calling them a female to check a box. And on the other side, if you use feminine voices and feminine mannerisms, well, you are just stereotyping women, and that is horrible. There is no way to win the woke game. There really, really isn't. So again, I understand the thought process behind this, and I understand that most of the people at Renegade probably believe this is good advice. It is absolutely stupid advice. Do not follow this advice. However, I do highly recommend learn about other cultures, and specifically learn about how those cultures have been portrayed in Western media, specifically white-run Western media, to find out what you're not supposed to do. And then, if you do take inspiration for another culture, understand someone's going to get upset about it. Every single time. If you are white and you are taking Japanese culture to inspire something, you are going to get in trouble. If you're black and you're putting Nordic culture into there, you're going to get in trouble. It's just how it is. Understand that you can't please everyone, and talk to your players. Your players have a wealth of knowledge that you do not have. If you are lucky enough to be able to have a diverse set of players, lean into them. Let them create some of your world. Probably the best thing in the world you can do as a game master is let your players help you build the world. And they don't have to sit there with every single planning session, but as they build their character, let them go, I really like my character to be from a place like this. Okay, well, let's come up with that place. We'll find an area in my world where we can make that a real place. Those are really, really great ways. It avoids a lot of the pitfalls that are described in this really stupid idea. And talk to, without your players. Talk to other friends that have different backgrounds, that are of different races, that are from different different monetary backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. These are all really, really great ways to make your world seem that much more real, because the real world is remarkably diverse. Again, even in Wisconsin, which is predominantly white, because it was settled mostly by German immigrants, and they got rid of most of the native population here. Even Wisconsin, which is primarily one color, I think it was Waukesha at one time was the most segregated, or no, Milwaukee actually was the most segregated city in the country, because each different ethnic group had their own section of the city, and they did not venture out of it. But even Wisconsin, like I have, when I was in high school, I had friends that were Hmong, because we have a remarkably large Hmong population here, and I got to learn about kind of their family traditions and things like that. It was really, really interesting. And because I was in theater, I had a lot of friends that were everywhere on the LGBTQ plus spectrum, and their experiences with life, and just the other things, especially as we became adults, the things that they got involved in were very, very, and the kind of friend groups that they form inside their own kind of cultures and things like that, and groups are very, very different, and I got to learn about a lot of different groups. But don't just put gay people in your thing because, well, I don't have enough gay people. You're going to insult someone. You're going to lean onto tropes that are not cool. I don't have a ton of gay NPCs in my games because I don't really talk about the sexual proclivities of most of my NPCs. And when it does come up, I have had NPCs that had that, but it's just something that doesn't come up. And if you're trying to shoehorn in, well, these people are gay, you're going to get in trouble. You're just going to get in trouble. Understand that gay people are exactly like every other person, and trans people are like every other person, and they exist everywhere in the world, and they don't have to make the entirety of their existence about their identity. I have a lot of friends in the LGBTQ plus spectrum, and remarkably enough, they live, they go entire months without having to tell people what their, sexual identity is. And they still exist. So, yeah, this is monumentally stupid. Again, I understand why you did it. It was a bad idea. People are going to get in trouble using this advice. It's really, really bad. The advice you should have given is the world is an amazingly massive, diverse place. Understand that diversity for diversity's sake is insulting and will get you in trouble. But if you want to create real lived-in worlds, you need to expand your understanding outside of your world. Talk to people that live on other sides of the country, that live in other countries. If you're in high school, foreign exchange students, at least when I was in high school, we had like 3 or 4 at my high school, and we weren't a massive high school. Get to know foreign exchange students. They're a huge source of just learning about an entirely different culture. And they tend to be really nice people. I don't think I've ever met a foreign exchange student that was an absolute asshole. There was like one when I was in high school that I didn't like, but it was because his sponsor was one of the assholes of the school, and he just kind of clinged on because he had to live with the guy, so he kind of clinged to this guy that was just an absolute asshole. But so yeah, find ways to learn about other cultures, specifically research how they have been misrepresented in this, and do everything you can to avoid that. But don't take an inventory and then go, well, not enough of my people are black, so I need this one's a black person because I have to have black people here. It's massively stupid. Don't do that. Okay, we're done with that. No more talking about it. After they talk about the roles of the GM, where they talk about like different GMing styles, like roles of the GM, the narrator, the arbiter, the ally, the coach, the world builder, GMing styles: benevolent, neutral, tactical, theatrical. They have this thing called GM Fiat, which is basically, the GM's ability to just... I've never heard the term GM Fiat. I'm not sure if that's just a term that I'm not familiar with that's used a lot in RPGs, or if they made it up for this. But it's basically just you're the GM and you're allowed to make your own rules. And I like that entire section where they talk about, you need to understand that as a GM you're allowed to do that. You need to be consistent, but you cannot be beholden to rules written by somebody else when you're creating your own stuff. And even if you're running a pre-written adventure, you're creating your own stuff. The way you and your players play it and the way you describe it is going to be different than how the designers did it. It's going to be different than how I play it. It's going to be different than how my friends play it. You are always creating your own custom content in an RPG, even when you're using other people's content. So understand you are allowed to make calls that go, in my world, I'm going to decide on this. You're allowed to change things to the system. Just make sure you're consistent, because if you're just making arbitrary rules, it frustrates your players, because it feels like there are no rules and the players can't plan what they want to do. If they're going to do something, going to be punished for it for a rule that they didn't know existed. They talk about, the idea of preparation versus improvisation and preparing to improvise. Like this whole chapter, the first part of it is just really good, information for GMs in general. Then they have Game Manager, the other side of GMing, which talks about more the mechanical aspects of it. They have a Session 0 section. And again, they put a very large emphasis on Session 0s are very, very useful. They are useful. They're not essential. You don't need to do a Session 0. However, you should be aware of what a Session 0 is, and it should be a tool in your toolkit. You should be able to do a Session 0 if that's what your players want, if it's going to work well for the game. Again, for Power Rangers, Session 0 is really essential because you can't have multiple people choose the same role. So that aspect of it, it is really useful. But the rest of it, we have fetishized Session 0s to, it is the be-all, end-all of running games, and if you don't do it, you're a monster. It's not true. Then they talk about safety tools, which again, I think are really, really useful. They talk about the X card. They talk about lines and veils, the RPG consent checklist, which I still have. I can tell you honestly from my experiences using the X card, lines and veils, and the RPG consent checklist, I have a mixture of new players and very seasoned players, and forcing them to fill out the RPG consent list creates more problems than it solves. It is a useful tool, and if you're going to be running, it's especially useful in things like horror genre style games, because you are going to be flirting with some really, really bad stuff, or if you're going to be getting to, if one of your players wants to have part of their backstory to have something about assault or something like that. Those are really essential things that you will want as part of that. But specifically always using the RPG consent checklist, it's going to cause more problems than it solves. Forcing people to use the X card system. The X card system is great. The very, very basic understanding of it is everybody gets an X card. An X card can be an actual card. It can be a poker chip. It can be a gesture. It can be a word. But as soon as that happens, the scene cuts to black and you go to something else. And it's used for if something comes up that a player just can't deal with for whatever reason. They don't have to worry about like leaving the game or something like that, or even worse, it triggering something like a PTSD flashback or something. However, if every single time you start a session, you hand out X cards to everyone, you go, okay, everyone remember, this is your X card and this is what you have to do, and I want everyone to understand how to use it. It's going to cause more problems than it solves. Have a tool available. Do not force people to use a tool that they don't want to use. There are some people that they will never use the X card because anxiety and actually doing something that kind of shows them and singles them out as I need this to stop is not something they can handle. So the X card doesn't work for everyone. and there are ways to get around it. Private messages to GMs and stuff like that. But there are some people that even if no one else will know that they invoked their X card, they will not use it because they will know they invoked the X card. So as much as, yes, the X card, really, really useful tool, you cannot force people to use it. The same thing is true about the RPG consent checklist, red, yellow, and green cards, lines and veils. All of these are very, very useful tools that you have to understand will not work for everyone. So moving on from that, they talk about character creation, which again, all of this is just really good stuff. Pacing, really good GM information. One thing they don't really talk about in the pacing section, which I wish they would, but again, would be a little bit complicated, is just how to run a session at a time limit. It's something that I had to learn doing convention work because you would get a 4-hour, most conventions give you a 4-hour block. And the very next game starts right at the end. So if a convention is open for 12 hours, you will have 3 4-hour blocks. And what that means is if people are playing in 3 games that day, if you go right up to the end of your block, they're going to be late to their next block. And that causes problems. And so time management is a really, really important skill to learn when you do convention stuff. And it's actually really useful for other, for home games and stuff like that as well. And they don't talk about that in here. And again, it's a really complicated topic. But I would have liked to see something about that in the pacing section, because this is just really talking about story structure and how to build up a story. But it doesn't really talk about actual pacing as far as like time limits and things like that. So it's still good information. I just wish they would have had something in here about that, because that's really, really useful information that takes years to learn. Then they have stuff about managing combat, managing your world, managing players. And this is where they talk about the different kinds of players. The actor, the instigator, the cutthroat. Which again, I'm not a huge fan of labeling players by any of these titles. However, there is a time and place to understand that this does sometimes apply to people. In general, you will never find someone that is only one of these things. I don't think I've ever met, like, optimizers, one of the types of players. I have never met a pure optimizer. They're always a combination of 3 or 4 different things. However, it's nice to have it named and stuff like that. And then they have a section on problem players. And this is the one where I think, again, the way that they phrase this is not so much that these are horrible people. They present these as problems to solve, as opposed to these are bad people and you need to make sure that you punish them. And I like the fact that that's the approach that they take for this. Because so often, especially if you watch like RPG horror stories, or you're on the D&D Reddit at all, people are always asking for advice with problem players. And the advice that I always see on Reddit is, get rid of them, they're toxic. And that is a really, really great way to ensure that you don't have players. All players have toxic traits. Every one of them. I have toxic traits. And I think I'm a great player. And I've been GMing, like I said, for a decade for thousands of people. Everybody has toxic traits. If as soon as you see a toxic trait, you cut someone out of your life or kick them off the table, you're not going to have any players left. So the fact that they focus on these not as these are problem players, this is how you identify them, but these are problems that players can have, and this is a solution to make it so that they can still play with you. I like that approach. That's not an approach that tends to happen often online. Excuse me. And it's an approach that needs to be focused on more. It's significantly harder than just kicking out problem players from your table. But in the long run, it's significantly better. Because what happens when you kick a problem player out is they blame you, not them. Kicking a problem player does not fix the problem player. You are just sending it off to someone else. And there's a good chance that they will create other problem players, because a lot of times the quote-unquote problem player is not hated universally. there's always going to be one or two people that doesn't mind the problem player and gets really upset when they get kicked out for something that they didn't think was that big a deal. So always kicking out problem players creates more problem players, because they are going to not realize what they were doing was wrong, and they're going to consider you a toxic person because you don't understand player choice, or you are too controlling, or anything like that. So yeah, I like that whole thing. And then they have a thing, system not setting, where they're basically talking about the Essence 20 is a system, it's not a game setting. And just kind of go over the basics of how the Essence 20 works and how to adapt it to different settings, which is really nice. They talk about dice shifts and edges and snags and story points, all really essential parts of running an Essence 20 game. You talk about defeat, which is really good. They talk about leveling up and how they generally tend to use milestones. And then they have specific sections on GMing each thing. So GMing Power Rangers, and they talk about tone and how Power Rangers tends to be a little more camp and silly. And then they talk about like what G.I. Joe means to your Power Rangers game. So how the existence of G.I. Joe is going to change your Power Rangers game if you decide that they're in the same universe or anything like that. If you're going to do crossover episodes. The same thing Transformers means to your Power Rangers game. Then they do the same thing for G.I. Joe. They do the same thing for Transformers. This is all really, really, really good information for GMs, not just for running these, but if you want to kind of emulate the style of storytelling that shows up in these in other game systems, this is really, really good. Then they also have plot hooks for crossover episodes, which I really, really like. And some of them they actually will introduce. They will introduce some slight new mechanics in here just to kind of work well with GMing that particular crossover, which I think is kind of cool. Then GMing Transformers and how Power Rangers affects Transformers, and how G.I. Joe affects Transformers, and over and over and over again. And that is chapter 4. I need another glass of water because I'm starting to lose my voice from talking too much. Much better. Moving on. Chapter 5. Creating threats. This, to be blunt, this is an essential thing. I wish all of this information had existed in the core books. But to be perfectly honest, it makes more sense in the crossover books than it makes in any of the core books, because it talks about the kind of generic, this is how Essence 20 threats work, and then it talks about how threats in each system works and how it kind of modifies, and it wouldn't really make sense without being able to compare all of them. So again, I wish this existed in each of the other core books. It just works better here. 100%. It does give you threat level versus player level balancing things in here. Spoiler alert. Total of PC's levels divided by 4 equals appropriate threat level. I'm just going to let you guys know that right now. It's more complicated than that. Combat balance is always more complicated than that, but it's a really nice thing to learn. And it's nice that it's all here. Then they have a section on how to design threats, which is really, really good. Like, it just, like, everything in here is stuff I wish I'd had when I ran my game. It's one of the reasons why I think for an Essence20 GM, this is almost an essential book, because there's just so much in here about making your own custom threats and everything like that. Like, it's really, really good stuff. And compared to what I was doing, which was basically reverse engineering from looking at a bunch of threats, this is so much better. And it makes for so much better characters and monsters and things like that. And it doesn't just do mechanics. Like, it does talk about story development and how to build a villain in general, but it's mostly mechanics. And then they talk about designing vehicle threats. Then they have a section on context, and this is a new thing that they kind of talk about in Across the Stars, but they flesh it out for anyone here. Is the idea of contacts and basically being able to summon allies in combat. And this is a whole system that I really, really like. I talked about, again, this basic system in Across the Stars I thought was cool. This generifies it. I don't know if that's the right word, if that even is a word, but it makes it so you can use contacts in literally every system. And I love the contact system because it's basically if your players latch onto an NPC, which they always will. Your players are going to latch onto certain NPCs. You are not going to be able to pick which NPCs the players latch onto. It never happens that way. It never works that way. But the contact system basically allows them to get benefits from befriending certain things and have them actually kind of join in and fight. Basically, it gives you a summon ability to call in a friend. And it's cool. I love everything about it. I think it's really awesome. They have a system to keep it balanced so that, they're not just breaking everything with it. And there are contact perks and contact hang-ups and like everything about this. Like two of the example contacts that they have is a benevolent mob, which is basically if you watch Power Rangers in Space, final episode, Astronema comes out, says, Power Rangers, you need to give up, reveal yourselves, or I'm going to kill everybody here. And the Power Rangers don't know what to do. They've lost their powers. They're worried, like Astronema's won. And as Astronema is threatening, Bulk and Skull step up. Bulk and Skull were the villains, or they were the comic release, but they were bullies in Mighty Morphin Season 1. And they went through this weird, wonderful evolution to where in the end of Power Rangers in Space, they have this I am Spartacus moment where they step forward. He's like, I am the Blue Ranger. And these people with no powers or anything just start stepping forward and go, I'm the Yellow Ranger. I'm the Pink Ranger. Yeah, if you want to attack them, attack us. We're going to defend them instead of them defending us for once. And then the real Rangers show up because they're emboldened by everyone and they start fighting. And then the mob there, led by Bulk, he goes, come on, guys, let's go help them. And they go in and they help the Power Rangers fight. That's what Benevolent Mob is. And I love that. And then the other example contact that they have is the Phantom Ranger, which I really, really like. Because the Phantom Ranger was a super cool character that they never really expanded upon in the show, and they've expanded on him in the comics, and he's really cool. And then they do a section for each game, Power Rangers threat design and the things that you want to focus on if you're creating threats for Power Rangers, which again, really essential. And they talk specifically about the fact that Power Rangers monsters grow and how to make those changes. Then they give examples of Power Rangers monsters. They have a minion, and then they have a Monster of the Week style monster. G.I. Joe threat design and how all that stuff works and then examples of G.I. Joe threats. And then Transformers threat design. Same basic thing. All of this really, really good stuff. And then a section on crossover threat design. So how do you create threats that are going to be challenging for different groups, like a combination of G.I. Joes and Power Rangers? How is that going to work? So this, again, another really useful, essential section. And the art here for these custom threats that they make, it's really cool. Like one of the custom threat, one of them for crossovers is Roth Fastimius the 13th, interdimensional game poacher. And they call him a typical crossover threat. This seasoned alien hunter hails from a highly advanced alien civilization of a neighboring dimension that thrives on the glory of the hunt. He appears human, but with light gray skin and a body filled with cybernetic augmentations. Roth The 13th of his name is always looking for the next trophy to take down and add to his family's expansive menagerie. This is such a cool character. It's a threat level 12. Like, everything about it is just massively cool. And they have custom artwork for it, and he looks kind of like Deadshot from Valiant Comics. I think that's the guy's name, Dead something. But he's just super cool. And he has this cloak and this cool hood. He's got a massive like broadsword on his back and a sniper rifle. Like, everything about him is just cool. So that's chapter 5. Moving on. Chapter 6. Creating scenes. I'm going to have no voice at the end of this. Again, this is basically how to design a scene. So Essence20 is built on a episode scene system, which is basically how most entertainment is written. Whether you're talking theater, television shows, movies, and even novels and things like that tend to follow a scene-based system where you'll have a scene is all the action that happens in a specific place at a specific time. And when that particular, each scene has its own little conflict and scene thing like that. And so when you base things by scene, like our brains have been trained to see things like that just because that's all the entertainment that we watch is all kind of scene-based. So this is just basically, step by step, this is how you design a scene. And it talks about, success and failure. It's just really good information, just in general. And if you're not comfortable running things in a scene-based system compared to like D&D is based, like old school D&D was a lot of like dungeon crawls where you would make this real big thing and it wouldn't really go scene by scene. It would go area by area or encounter by encounter. And scenes can be an encounter by encounter, but you can have multiple encounters in a single scene or certain scenes that don't have any encounters whatsoever. So I like the scene-based system, and this is a really, really good example of it. Yeah, I'd love to go into more specifics, but it's just kind of nitty gritty. This is how you build story. It's good. It's really, really good, but there's not a whole lot I can say without, getting into really nerdy, story stuff. This is the section where it has chases and talks about chases. I love chases. They're so good. And they talk about chases can also be used to run races. If you want to have some sort of race aspect, which again, super, super fun. Remember there's an episode of Acquisitions Incorporated where all they did was they ran a dinosaur race. And it was really, really entertaining. So anything that gives rules for running chase scenes or race scenes or something like that, like I'm a huge fan. And then they give an example of a sample chase to just understand. They have a puzzle section, which again, the puzzle section, in my particular opinion, I really wish they would have had an example puzzle in here, and they don't. And I think it's okay advice, but designing puzzles is hard. And without an example makes it difficult, to be blunt. Then they have a section on how to make traps in that, and that one they do have examples. And they have a section on how combat scenes run specifically, which again, very, very useful. One of my favorite things they put in here is action economy. Villains don't fly solo. They specifically talk about how action economy in most games, whichever side is going to have more actions that they can do is going to have an advantage. So try to avoid having a single bad guy against an entire team of rangers unless you've done something to give the bad guy more things they can do per turn, because they're going to get squashed if they can't. So yeah, more combat stuff, and then they go into specifics for each role. So Power Ranger, or each game, Power Ranger scene design. Again, really, really good stuff. They talk about Zords and all that, and how to kind of expect when they show up and when they won't. And then G.I. Joe's scene design. And then Transformers scene design. crossover scene design. Again, they do it the same way each time, and it works well each time they do it. Moving on. Chapter 7. Creating Adventures. Again, just really good advice for how to write an adventure. I think one of my favorite things is starting by concluding. Because the beginning of an adventure ties into its conclusion, and the final scenes are your adventure's last impressions, the end of your adventure is a good place to start. This is really, really good writing advice. You don't have to do that. You can start and kind of write and see where it goes, but especially if you have a goal in mind, starting from the end and kind of working your way backwards works really well. And this is just full of that. Like, they show how different you can use different flowcharts to organize things. Like, this is just nitty gritty good writing advice. Like, this is stuff that I have seen in writing seminars and stuff like that. It's good advice on how to write stuff. And again, there's not really a whole lot I can say other than read it. It's really, really good. Oh, and they do use the denouement. The reason I bring that up, Matt Colville, whom I have the utmost respect for, but I think he puts his head up his ass a little bit too often. He went on this tirade at one point because people were talking about role-playing games are collaborative storytelling. And he goes, "It's not collaborative storytelling. Where is the denouement?" Which that isn't how you pronounce it. It's actually denouement. But it's spelled denouement. And what the denouement is basically the falling action. It's how you close the story is what the denouement is. And it's a really, really hoity-toity writing school term. Like, if you actually have had traditional education, if you're a classically trained writer, you're going to label things, the climax and the denouement and all that stuff. And you 100% don't need to be a classically trained writer to write stories and have collaborative storytelling. And RPGs are collaborative storytelling. Just because there are no rules, because what his point was where are the rules that force you to put in a denouement? There aren't. Because you don't need to force people to do that. That's a natural aspect of telling a story. There's going to be... denouement is basically what happens at the end. How do you wrap up the story? It's a natural part of the storytelling process. You have to do it. Otherwise, the story feels unfinished. So you don't have to force people to do it. It will happen naturally. So that's why I always bring up the denouement, the denouement, because I always it's the same thing of like, because I'm a music geek. If somebody goes, "Oh, I'm a really big fan of classical music," I go, "Really? So do you prefer Mozart or Mendelssohn?" And they go, "Actually, I'm a big fan of Tchaikovsky." "Ha ha 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 ha! That's not classical music, dear boy. That is romantic music." Well, I guess Bach's a big fan. "Oh, ho, 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 ho. Dear boy, that is not classical. That is Baroque." It's the same basic thing. When people say classical music, they generally refer to anything from the Baroque period all the way up through the Romantic period and a little bit of the early 20th century music. That's what they consider, quote-unquote, classical music. But if you're a music nerd like me, you'll say, "Oh yeah, my favorite classical composer is Tchaikovsky." "Ha ha ha! You're so stupid because he's not a classical composer. He's actually a romantic composer, early 20th century romantic composer. He's not a classical composer at all because he did the classical period of music." It's really stupid, elitist bullshit by forcing people to use terms that you only learn if you actually go into classical study of it. So that's why I always bring that up. I do find it really funny that they do put the denouement in there. I thought that was hilarious. Then you talk about leveling and rewards and other stuff like that. Again, all this stuff really good. I can't really go into specifics because it's good storytelling advice is what it is. They do talk about rewards and things like giving them new gear, giving them upgrades, giving them non-gear rewards, like giving them allies or giving them energy reserves or things like that. Or you could even give them essence point rewards as well. So stuff like that. And then Adventures on Your Players, really talking about how to incorporate your players into the storytelling process, because nothing is more kind of anticlimactic than creating a really cool character and then being able to play them and finding out that your character is basically a side story in the GM's adventure. And nothing about your character really matters. You could have brought, a block of salt with a pointy end, and it would have had the same impact on the adventure. So being able to kind of incorporate your PCs and let them not just be a part of your story, but be a driving force of their own story that you are helping to tell. Again, good advice and stuff like that. We talk about downtime. Then again, they go Power Rangers adventure design. Talk about all the stuff there and some of the things you want to avoid. G.I. Joe adventure design. All the stuff there. And talk about in media res, which I'm a huge fan of in media res, but it's really, really overused. For anyone who doesn't know what in media res is basically starting the story in the middle of the action instead of having kind of an introduction and then you build up to the action. You just start in the middle of a fight or something. And it's massively overutilized in Hollywood, but I really like it. So yeah, and then Transformers adventure design, and they all end with example plots for each system, which I like. And then crossover adventure design, and yeah, so that's chapter 7. Good chapter, but just not a lot of me to comment on, other than yes, this is good writing advice. Moving on. Chapter 8. Crossover adventure. This is the actual adventure that they have in here. And so the interesting thing about this, and this is something that I used to like about the Adventurers League. I don't know if they still do it because I haven't played Adventurers League stuff in years. But they have an introduction for each different group. So just because I really love doing this voice, I'm going to read you the box text from the Power Rangers introduction. Alpha 5 scurries from panel to panel, frantically pressing buttons when you teleport in behind him. Ay, 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 ay! Where could he be? How could he just disappear? Alpha 5 finally notices you've arrived. Oh, thank goodness you're here. I've lost a ranger. And it goes on from there. It's a really nice introduction that feels really, really rooted in Power Rangers, and it gives a reason why the Power Rangers are going to be involved in this thing. And something nice about this, they have an adventure overview. There's 3 parts of the adventure, and part 1 describes what it is. It gives you the objective of that part. Part 2 describes what it is, gives you the objective of that part. Part 3 describes what it is, gives the objective of that part. That is really, really useful. Again, because I used to run convention stuff, that was an essential part of any convention thing, because I would use that as part of my timing. Because again, I had to stick to my periods, and so I would go through stuff like this, and I go, okay, part 1 should take about this long, and part 2 should take about this long, and part 3 should take about this long, and I'd be able to make sure I was keeping to my schedule, just because I would always have the adventure overview sitting in front of me, even as I was going through the rest of it. I would tear that page out and put that, or I'd get a copy of it and make sure that it was always there. It was really, really useful. So I like that that's there. And then they have Introduction G.I. Joe, Introduction Transformers, and then they get to the actual part 1, part 2, part 3. The adventure itself, I think, is interesting. It's got maps. It's got a lot of different stuff. They have some contacts in here. that you can use in this, which I really, really like. And they've got some new threats in here. One thing that they do a lot in this is they will go, by the way, we're going to use this stat block from this book, and they'll give you the page number and book that you're supposed to look up, but they don't give you absolutely everything in this book everywhere. I don't know if in this particular adventure if you actually have to use other stats. I think they might give you all the stats that you need for this particular adventure in the book. But understand that, yeah, the book as a whole does reference things. And again, they have different endings. You have victory, defeat, and everything in between for each section. So part 2, go through it, all these other cool things, maps, everything, cool stuff to do. New equipment and other stuff like that. And then part 3, like, everything about this is really cool and really interesting. Yeah, like I just, it's a really good book. And that is the end. So moving on. So final thoughts. This is a hell of a book. It really, really is. There is so much in here that will improve whatever game you're playing. You're going to get the most benefit if you already own the 3 other core books. But GMs in general can get a benefit out of every single part of this book. And players can get benefits out of most of the book as long as they own at least 1 or 2 other books. So overall, I cannot kind of overemphasize just how impressed I was with this book. It is a phenomenally well-written book. It creates very simple solutions to very complex problems that I didn't think were going to have simple solutions for. And that in and of itself is difficult. And all the new options and all the new kind of customizability built into this, you can create some just massively weird-ass characters with this. I might have to do a Designing New Dragons sometime, probably not anytime soon, where I just make these hybrid characters just to show you how many weird, crazy things you can do with it. But overall, I'm impressed with this book. I'm super, super glad I picked it up. I cannot wait for my physical copy to arrive in August. And yeah, I can't wait to see the next books. Definitely pick them up. Otherwise, that is going to be all for me today. As always, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to turn notifications on in the comments down below. Now that you've heard everything, what are you most excited about in this book? Is it the character options and the weird hybrid characters you can make? Is it the just plethora of GM info that allow you to really run your own Essence20 games? Is it the adventure itself and just being able to have Transformers working alongside G.I. Joe and stuff like that? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that is all for me today. I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.